let me very excitedly introduce Imelda Wong with NIOSH. We appreciate you being here, Imelda. I saw Adrian join as well. I don't know if Adrian's joining you today too, or is it just going to be you?
I think it's going to be me, but Adrian is welcome to chime in if she likes.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. And we're going to talk a little bit about workplace fatigue, which is a really interesting topic and probably under discussed. Is that a word? Just something that's not talked about often enough. But are we getting tired in the workplace? You have so much in the news today about people who are quitting their jobs and they don't want to work anymore, and we have so many openings. Where are we at today, and what are you seeing? We're looking forward to you sharing and imparting your knowledge on us here, Imelda. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen if I can. Where we are, I think we're hearing a lot about burnout these days. We're hearing a lot about quiet quitting. Doesn't look like I can share my screen at this time.
Oh, here, hold on one second.
Sorry.
Try it now.
Excellent, thank you. I also wanted to thank the previous speakers for their wonderful presentations. There's a lot of crossover with what I'm going to be talking about today. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. We talked about life skills. In fatigue, we talk a lot about, it's very similar. It's harm reduction, right? So there are things that happen at work and there are things that happen at home. And so I think we're moving into this new world where there's hybrid working, but also there's things that influence home life, and there's things that at work that influence home life, and there are things at home life that influence work. And so this is really where we are with fatigue, especially as we're coming out of the pandemic. So today I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about what is fatigue and its effects, but for most of the time I'll be addressing how we can mitigate the risks. So what is fatigue and why should we worry about it? And so I think we all have a general idea of what fatigue means, but as you can see here, there's several different definitions. Most of them are centered around being sleepy and feeling tired. There are some interpretations related to level of effort required for tasks and stemming from other sources, such as neurologic conditions and workload. But what really becomes evident is that fatigue is more than just sleepiness, and its effects are more than just falling asleep. And so knowing this difference between sleepiness and fatigue can help us better develop targeted fatigue mitigation strategies. And so this is where work and life and life events can attribute to fatigue. You can see that fatigue can stem from a variety of different sources. What I have up here are the work-related factors that we're accustomed to seeing, such as shift timing, duration, and organizational factors. We talk about stress and exposures to heat or noise or light or chemicals. But there's also other things that are inherent to the individual, such as age and chronotype or sex. And then there's life or lifestyle factors such as health behaviors, commuting, and dependency care. We talked about someone who had 5 kids, my goodness, could not even imagine. That can have a significant impact on fatigue, it takes up a lot of brain space. And since there's such a wide variability of these factors across individuals, there's no one magic solution that can fit all situations for all sectors or organizations or even individuals. Fatigue can have a significant impact on cognition, such as slowing down reaction times, reducing attention or concentration, limiting short-term memory, and impairing judgment. It can also adversely affect mood and increase the propensity for risky behaviors. Fatigue, as it relates to non-standard schedules, such as night shift work or rotating shifts, can double the risk for work injury compared to those working regular daytime schedules. Studies have also identified the excess risk for injury attributed to poor sleep and non-standard schedules can account for 14% of workplace injuries. Fatigue also increases with time awake or time on task. And as you can see here, the injury rates for those working more than 60 hours per week is over double than those working less than 20 hours per week. And there's increased risk with increasing work hours. We also know that chronic poor sleep and shift work can have adverse gastrointestinal, reproductive, and metabolic effects. Shift workers have a 20% increased risk for cardiovascular disease, which can increase with more years of shift work. The International Agency for Cancer has determined night shift work as a probable human carcinogen. And as it becomes more evident during the pandemic, fatigue and mental health are very closely related. Fatigue can be a symptom of mental health issues, and it can exacerbate existing mental health issues through sleep impairment and reduced sleep quality. Work-related fatigue can also have a devastating public safety impact, particularly in occupations with high risk consequences. And a couple examples include the nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island and the grounding of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker. And on a more frequent scale, tired workers drive on public roads, raising public health and safety concerns. Fatigue workers may not have the time or energy to attend household responsibilities, with a consequent strain on their family life. And so my point here really is that the effects of work-related fatigue can be severe and widespread, and spillover effects with many other areas. The National Safety Council has described fatigue as a debilitating, potentially deadly problem affecting most Americans. So here's a snapshot of what fatigue looks like in the United States. In the occupational realm, worker fatigue is most commonly, again, associated with exposure to non-standard schedules, sleep disruption. Approximately 21 million workers, so that's nearly 20% of the workforce, are employed in schedules that are outside what's considered to be a regular daytime shift. And working these types of schedules has been associated with disrupted or impaired sleep. A recent survey found that 37% of workers get less than 7 hours of sleep, as recommended by the National Sleep Foundation. Almost 70% of night shift workers report not getting sufficient sleep, but surprisingly, almost 1/3 of day shift workers also do not get enough sleep, suggesting that this problem can affect any worker, regardless of work schedule. 90% of employers report that workplaces have been negatively impacted by tired employees. So this is in terms of reduced productivity and absenteeism. Only half say that they will adjust employees' schedules or tasks accordingly, but 70% will issue a warning or disciplinary action. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the problem and the solution. Studies have found that up to 2/3 of American workers report workplace fatigue, such that they feel that there's an increased effort that's needed to perform the tasks at a desired level. So this not only affects their ability to perform critical tasks, which can not only affect their safety at work, but also the safety of their coworkers. So what is the cost of work-related fatigue in the US? So before I get into this, I just want to preface this by saying I am not an economist, and this is not an in-depth comprehensive economic analysis, but this is just really used for economic illustrative purposes. These are really rough estimations gathered from a number of different sources and converted into present-day dollars for better comparison. So knowing that 14% of workplace injuries can be attributed to excess risk associated with poor sleep and non-standard schedules, we can roughly calculate that employers paid about $8.8 billion annually for direct costs for disabling non-fatal workplace injuries. And keep in mind, this is just a gross underestimation of the true cost, and only a fraction of work-related injuries are reported. A smaller percentage file a claim, and of those, an even smaller proportion are awarded compensation. The National Safety Council estimates the workplace fatigue related to sleep deficiencies, sleep disorders, and shift work cost employers about $170 billion in absenteeism and presenteeism. And again, this is a fraction of the true cost, as chronic sleep deprivation is also associated with depression, obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and other illnesses that may impact work productivity. Drowsy driving is of considerable concern these days. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, excuse me. Sorry, just getting over a cold here. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates that motor vehicle crashes on and off the job cost employers just over $72 billion annually. And so this is extrapolated further to an additional $157 billion attributed to the societal harm of drowsy driving crashes. The RAND Corporation has also recently estimated that the cost of poor sleep in the US equates to $498 billion in losses due to increased mortality rates, presenteeism amongst workers, and considerations for future losses of skill development of adolescents who do not get enough sleep. And so using these few broad estimations of fatigue based on sleep disturbances and exposure to shift work, we can crudely estimate that the total economic burden of workplace fatigue costs around $906 billion annually in the United States. However, I use the term total loosely because it only captures a fraction of the true cost and is mostly from the viewpoint of the employer or industry. What we really don't know is the cost to workers in terms of how it affects their daily life, such as with items such as household productivity, loss of enjoyment of leisure activities, or loss of income, which may occur with workplace fatigue related injuries or illnesses. So moving on to, how do we mitigate work-related fatigue risk? So on the surface, it might seem like a really easy hazard to address and mitigate. Why don't we just change the hours of work? Why don't we get enough sleep? So I'm going to suggest it's really not that simple. So you've seen there's no standard definition of fatigue, making it difficult to assess. There's no standard measure, making it difficult to quantify or compare. And again, it can stem from various occupational and non-occupational sources. And unlike other workplace hazards like chemical or biological exposures, there are no threshold limits. There's no cut point, making it difficult to determine how much is too much. Fatigue, as it's been described, is best viewed on a continuum. It's not like we're alert and vigilant one moment and then completely incapacitated the next. Fatigue can be transient and is usually a gradual onset. And so we've all experienced times when we suddenly fade off and then quickly snap back to attention. And so one of the biggest challenges of managing work-related fatigue is this. In some industries, there's a bravado surrounding working long hours and getting very little sleep. These pervasive attitudes about fatigue make it difficult to manage and mitigate. And as humans, we are terrible at estimating how impaired we are due to fatigue. Fatigue is ubiquitous to all situations. It can affect any worker, regardless of age or background in any organization or sector. And yet, some have accepted that workplace fatigue is the norm and an inevitable cost of doing business. So, despite all these challenges with mitigating fatigue, a fatigue risk trajectory model has been developed to describe a series of events or levels that precede fatigue-related incidents, such as injuries. So some of you may recognize this looks a lot like James Reason's Swiss cheese model of accident causation with the different levels that happen before the safety critical event occurs. So at the most basic level is providing opportunities for rest and recovery. And at the next level is really getting enough quality recovery. If this is not met, it can lead to fatigue-related behaviors and errors and potentially to fatigue-related incidents. So there's many potential solutions to mitigating work-related fatigue. So I'm not going to cover an exhaustive list today, but what I wanted to do is to highlight some of the solutions, including their challenges and trade-offs. So the traditional approach to managing fatigue at work is work scheduling, which includes hours of work, number of shifts, rest breaks within and between shifts. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about work scheduling because this is usually the main question that I'm asked by employers. In terms of injury or accident risk, there are four main trends in work scheduling that increase risk. This includes shift type, shift duration, hours on duty, and successive shifts. So when we look at shift type, you see the red line here is the reference line. It's how we compare risk. So anything above that reference line is an increased risk. So as you can see here, in comparison to morning shifts, afternoon and night shifts have an increased risk for injuries or accidents, with the highest risk for night shifts. Working more than 8 hours is above the red line. So you can see here with increasing hours between 9 and 12 hours, there's an increased risk for injuries and accidents in comparison to 8 hours, working 8 hours. When we think about blocks of shifts, we can see that with successive shifts, so as we're moving from 1 shift to 2 shift to 3 shift to 4 shift, there's an increased risk for injuries or accidents. The orange bars are daytime shifts. You can see there's an increased risk, but the risk is even higher for night shifts. So what's really interesting is when we put this all together and we talk about shift structure. This graph is particularly interesting because it combines the effects of shift type and shift duration. It shows a 48-hour work week broken down as 6 8-hour shifts, so that's the first 2 bars here, and 4 12-hour shifts, and so that's the last 2 bars here. And we can see, despite the same weekly work hours, that working 4 to 12 hours increases the risk in comparison to working 6 days of 8 hours of days and 6 days of 8-hour night shifts as we compare days to days and nights to nights. And again, the risk is always higher amongst night shifts. So work scheduling is unique to each organization and is based on a number of different factors. However, strategic incorporation of rest breaks can also reduce the risk for work injury. We need to consider frequency and timing and duration of breaks, both within and between shifts and sequences of shifts. Recommendations from prior studies include short, frequent breaks, up to 30 minutes, may be more protective than fewer, longer breaks. In general, at least 2 consecutive days of recovery between shifts can offset most work-related fatigue. However, the nature of work needs to also be considered. Work that is physically or mentally demanding or in the heat or is monotonous may require more time for recovery. Special considerations may be needed for night shift workers. Recovery sleep during daytime is less effective than recovery sleep during nights. So nights may need more recovery time in comparison to day shifts. But the key message here is that work scheduling requires a comprehensive approach and not just focusing on 1 or 2 components of a work schedule. Other schedule strategies that I'll touch on briefly include shift rotation, and this relates to blocks of shifts, and if they rotate forward from days to nights following normal wake and sleep cycles, or backwards from nights to days. Speed of rotation refers to how quickly a schedule switches between shift types, and some organizations strategically plan more complex job tasks near the beginning of shifts when workers may be most alert, or they may rotate workers or groups of workers through different job tasks to give them a break. So after providing opportunities for rest, how can you encourage workers to utilize this time to obtain adequate amounts of quality rest? And so one suggested approach is to provide training and education, which the prior speakers did talk about. So there's many different considerations that can be made in developing training and education programs. This includes the level of information. Should it be broad? Should it be more detailed? The type of language that's being used. And again, this requires really knowing your audience so your programs are relatable. And again, our speakers from Verizon and Boots were great in giving us some examples for that. Programs that incorporate participant interaction, such as goal setting activities, have also been very effective. And of course, there's different delivery modes, such as in-person classroom scenarios or through web-based applications or mobile apps. So what works? Education that is relatable to the working population is better received and adopted. So here's an example that I've given here. This is the NIOSH fatigue prevention training for Alaskan pilots. It was developed in consultation with Alaskan pilots and feature Alaskan pilots in the examples. So as a result, we found that pilots related to the specific scenarios in the videos. They recognized, hey, that's Joe, that's down the street. He works in the same building as me. If this works for him, it might work for me. And they really found it that they were a lot more receptive to adopting the behavioral changes to improve sleep and fatigue. We heard providing short lessons. So again, our colleagues from Verizon talked about these short videos. It could be an informal 15-minute weekly safety talk. Gives people time to digest small bits of information and adopt those behavioral changes. Again, behavioral changes over time. Combining knowledge and personalized strategies, such as individual goal setting, makes it easier to focus on specific lifestyle changes for the long term. And including programs in a fatigue risk management plan or safety management plan has the most success at reducing fatigue risk. So as we move along the fatigue risk trajectory, we reach levels 3 and 4, which relate to fatigue-related behaviors and errors. And so one way of reducing these risks are to use methods to measure and evaluate. We have surveys and biomathematical models, which are traditional methods and have been around for decades. However, with the advances in technology, there's been substantial interest with fatigue detection technologies, which really started in the transportation industry. It's been estimated that the global market on driver monitoring systems alone is projected to grow from 1.6 billion from 2019 to 2.4 billion by 2027. However, fatigue detection technologies are not limited to vehicles now, and other sectors are starting to incorporate their use. So I'm going to run through these really quickly. With surveys, here's some examples of sleepiness and fatigue surveys where respondents self-rate their fatigue or sleepiness over a certain time. These can be administered with paper copies, online surveys, or more recently with mobile apps. Some of these have been around for quite some time and are standards used in research. The benefits are that they can be relatively easy to administer, and some have been validated with gold standard laboratory measures such as EEGs. But the challenges are, as we become more fatigued, our ability to self-assess impairment degrades. And it's difficult as a safety professional or employer to identify when immediate fatigue mitigation measures are needed. Biomathematical models and fitness for duty tests are two methods to predict periods of high fatigue. Biomathematical models are software programs which use prior work schedules and sometimes prior sleep and wake information in their predictions. Fitness for duty tests are just a piece of equipment that workers use before they start their shift to predict their fatigue risks during that shift. It's usually a cognitive reaction test to some sort of visual or audio cue as an indicator of fatigue. And so the benefit of these predictive measures is that it can allow for preemptive measures such as rescheduling the tasks, if possible, to avoid safety critical events. The challenge, however, is that they don't consider things that might happen during the shift, like exposure to heat or unexpected emergencies like equipment breakdowns, which can increase fatigue and ultimately the risk for safety critical events. Task performance measures and physiological measures are typically what people associate with fatigue detection technologies. This includes things like in-vehicle telematics to monitor driving performance, such as lane width deviation or hard braking. Some of these are already available in vehicles on the commercial market. Wearable sensors are really popular right now. As Iona had mentioned in Boots, ones that specifically examine worker fatigue use measures such as eyelid droop or blink rate. These are technologies that claim to look at heart rate variability and galvanic skin response, but these yet have to be fully validated. And so the benefits of these kind of devices is that they can provide real-time feedback to workers and offsite safety managers to implement an immediate safety response. The challenge is that it can be expensive, especially if organizations are outfitting the entire company, which raises the question, does everyone in the organization need to use these technologies all the time? Or should they only be used with workers with a high risk of fatigue or those with severe consequences if they have a safety critical event? We've heard of employers who've used technologies intermittently for coaching purposes or measuring after effects following organizational change, such as a change in shift schedule. And as we heard, these are technologies, they might be finicky or might not work in situations at low light or extreme heat. And these, again, are really monitoring devices. And that's really where it starts to get a bit sticky, as we heard, again, from Iona, in terms of user acceptability and privacy issues. And so this is monitoring the worker. So you might get some pushback, or in some cases, the worker may not use the technology as intended. So how can we make these work? The key here is that trust needs to be built. And again, Iona did a great job at building up how they built trust in Boots. It starts at the leadership level, as you've seen, and involves collaboration with management, health and safety professionals, and workers, involving workers in the early stages, and choosing and implementing fatigue detection technologies builds trust in the system and ensures whatever is chosen will work within the regular workflow and job tasks, because no one really wants these things to interfere with their regular work tasks. It also helps to reassure that these will not be used for punitive purposes, which increases user acceptability and ensures that technologies will be used as intended. Some of our industry partners have implemented technologies in small pilot groups to get feedback on their effectiveness, and then they build on these small wins. They then share the results with other workers and use a graduated approach to fatigue management depending on the frequency and severity of the readings from these sensors. So for example, in comparison to baseline measures, these actions could range from retesting for fatigue risk, assigning to alternate duties, or providing more frequent rest breaks. And really at the very end of the scale is not authorizing work to continue. Success stories from our industry partners also mention incorporating these devices into a holistic fatigue risk or safety management system and not relying on these as the sole or primary fatigue mitigation strategies. So I've included links to our science blogs on this topic, and this is an infographic stemming from one of those blogs. So at the very last level of the fatigue risk trajectory are fatigue-related incidents. When we get to this stage, is there really anything we can do to reduce the risk for a safety critical event like an injury? Absolutely. Fatigue risk management systems have been identified as a long-term sustainable strategy to address or reduce the risk of future safety critical events like work injuries. So over the past 10 years, fatigue risk management systems have emerged across many 24/7 industries, such as flexible and sustained method to reduce employee fatigue risk. The Federal Aviation Administration has mandated fatigue risk management systems for several years now, and the Federal Railroad Administration has recently adopted this approach as well. And so a proposed definition of fatigue risk management system is a scientifically based, data-driven addition or alternative to prescriptive hours of work limitations, which manages employee fatigue in a flexible manner to the level of risk exposure and the nature of the operation. So I really like this definition. You can see there's some key terms. It's scientifically based. So it's based on sound research and studies. It's data-driven, sometimes from the organization to identify what is working and what is not. Again, it's an alternative prescriptive hours of work because managing fatigue is more than just hours of work. And it provides the flexibility because there is considerable variability across different job tasks, individuals, and organizations. So at the end of this presentation, I've included references to different fatigue risk management systems for your reference. Despite all the different iterations, there are 6 main components. So very briefly, it includes policies and procedures, which are usually already exist in the organization. There's the roles and responsibilities of management employees, which may include a clear description of who should be informed and when there is a safety critical event. There's risk assessment and management, which includes items such as hours of work, fatigue and safety risk and measures for non-punitive reporting. There's training and educational programs, which promote knowledge and fatigue mitigation strategies for both employers and for workers. There's control and action plans that include fatigue management tools and decision trees. And lastly, there's an audit and review component to keep reevaluating fatigue risk management to ensure their effectiveness, especially as times keep changing. So the literature suggests there are several strategies for a successful fatigue risk management system. Again, introduce this changes slowly, preferably one at a time, so you can determine which ones work the best and have the greatest impact, and then continue building on the momentum of these small wins. Building a healthy work culture is key, requires open communication from all levels of management, labor, and starts at leadership. It requires engaging workers, informing solutions rather than penalizing them or imposing solutions. Successful fatigue risk management systems require frequent monitoring and feedback to continuously adapt to the changing needs of the organization workforce. And sharing information about what works and doesn't work within the organization across the industry helps everyone move forward at managing fatigue. And so this is why these types of webinars are so important. There are several take-home messages I hope you'll remember from this presentation. Fatigue is complex, it's multifaceted, it can stem from a variety of occupational and non-occupational sources. Its effects can reach far beyond the workplace and can have implications for public safety. Fatigue cannot be eliminated, but rather it needs to be managed. And in order to do so requires providing controls along each level of the fatigue risk trajectory. And there is no magic solution that will fit all industries, organizations, or situations. Rather, it takes a multi-level approach to managing work-related fatigue, where the most effective measures take place at the organizational level. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention. I'd like to direct you to our Center for Work and Fatigue Research website for further resources. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any time, but it looks like we're a little bit over right now. So I will throw this back to you, Kevin, and we can move forward to what needs to be done.
Yeah, no, Imelda, thank you very much. And we're a little over, but I think we're okay too, because we have a lot of people that tune into this after the fact to come back and catch the end if they had to leave, a little earlier. Or for the folks that have registered that didn't even make it back. So no worries there. It's interesting that, this is, that you're starting to hear more about this and more about this. I think anybody who travels obviously not only hears it, but feels it, because we see that you mentioned the airline industry, and, we hear, well, the crew can't, they have to switch out the crew now because the mandate is that they've flown X number of hours or they've worked so many hours that they can't go. The fact that the flight was delayed 4 hours, and now they are off schedule. Hearing that a lot. I'm hearing it more, especially in warehouse operations, I think on the retail side, that are starting to understand and really start to respect the statistics and the data that groups like yourselves are putting forward to demonstrate. I mean, your shift work there, your overnight shifts and your shift work, your 8 hours versus your 12 hours. Where else are you seeing this start to flourish? I'm still seeing I'm not hearing a lot about it from the law enforcement community and from the emergency responders. What are you hearing from like hospitals and things like that, where those 12-hour shifts are so common? And most of us just aren't getting enough sleep. So I guess we'll look at two pieces, right? One is what are some of the industry impact that you're seeing? And then what's advice from a personal perspective? I mean, a lot of this stuff we also have to take into our own on our own responsibility, right?
Right.
Tips and ideas there.
So what I'm seeing right now is it's actually happening across all industries. Where it's mostly highlighted right now is in the healthcare industry. We're seeing people are working longer hours, healthcare workers are working long hours, but it's not only the hours of work, they're also seeing a higher workload. And so we're hearing about the Great Resignation. There's a lot of people that have left the workforce, leaving, that those that have remained in the workforce to work overnight shifts or longer shifts, but their work intensity has also increased quite a bit as well. And so that's all contributing to workplace fatigue. And so we're seeing this across the board. I'm glad that you pointed out warehouse workers. We're hearing this as well. The Teamsters Union has come forward and asked us to help with providing some guidelines on how to manage workplace fatigue for warehouses. We're just seeing this across the board, especially with COVID. We're seeing a lot of people are working from home. There's that blurring of line between work and home, and some people can't make that distinction. I am guilty of that. It's just easy to just keep working when you don't have that definitive stop. And so that's to answer your question. We're really seeing it everywhere. We're hearing about burnout. Burnout's a big thing right now. We're hearing that it's affecting people's mental health. You heard me say that fatigue and mental health are very closely related, and that's become extremely evident now as COVID has come and is starting to move forward, but we're still dealing with the after effects. As for personal strategies, I like what the previous speakers had talked about in life skills. We call it harm reduction, but these are really life skills. And we're at NIOSH, we're not talking about penalizing the work, but we want to ensure that the worker remains healthy and productive through their entire careers. And so that really means that the organization has to provide opportunities for rest and recovery, but it's also a shared responsibility for the worker to take care of themselves as well, because our workforce depends on employers and workers as a whole.
Well, and you raised a really good point from the standpoint of the fact that a lot of us now are working more from home than we are going to the office, right? So there's even more importance put on the need for self-care, self-managing, and whether that's just shutting down at the right time and either doing something else or making sure that you're spending time with family. There's that work-life balance piece that comes into play there. But really also the self-care and making sure that you are getting enough sleep and enough rest, and that you're aware that your schedule went a little too long today, so maybe you want to shave a little bit tomorrow. I think the healthcare thing, obviously the pandemic really brought a lot of this to light, with the amount of stress and anguish and frustration that people had, the amount of cases that healthcare workers were faced with, and that forced longer hours on the healthcare industry, I would think, right? And there, like you said, the caseload is up. There's more people that have been sick. So I'm glad to hear that you're hearing a lot more on the healthcare side, paying attention to this. But I think the retail side definitely needs to be aware of it. I mean, we do tend to work more 8-hour shifts, I think, for the most part, but still going back to those warehouse operations, you've got so many folks that are working overnights, working those 12-hour shifts, and to see that. It's one thing to hear it and say, oh yeah, well, I didn't get enough sleep, or I worked that late shift, but I've got my schedule managed. But when you look at the numbers that you put up there, just fascinating to see how the reality actually shows through in those graphs, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I think if we have any other questions for Imelda, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and submit them through the Q&A. We will reach out and get those responses for you, and make sure that we publish them out to the group. Let me just share my screen here. There we go. Perfect. So as we sort of wrap things up here. Beautiful. Imelda, thank you very much. Adrian, I know you were there in the background and you were here in spirit supporting. So thank you very much for helping put this together for us. I think this was really valuable information, and we appreciate everything that you guys at NIOSH are doing. You've always been so supportive of the magazine, of the loss prevention industry, and we can't thank you enough for all the great work that you guys are doing. So thank you both. Appreciate it very much. So quick thank you again to all of our sponsors, to Genetech, to Protos, Hanwha Techwin, Salient, Everbridge, Reveal, NetWatch, and Axon. Again, please do visit these vendors. Please do check out the solutions that they have to offer, and learn a little bit more about them. If you are LPC or LPQ certified, please make sure that you keep track of this session. You get 3 CEU credits for today's session. Don't forget to subscribe to Loss Prevention Magazine. It is free today and tomorrow, but do it today. losspreventionmedia.com. Sign up for the digital and the print versions of all of the outputs from Loss Prevention Magazine. Make sure you download the LP portal from the Google Play and Apple iOS stores to connect yourself to just about everything AP, safety, risk, and a lot more. And with that, on behalf of myself, Jack Britton, of Louise from the UK, and from everybody at Loss Prevention Magazine and Loss Prevention Foundation, we want to thank you for tuning in today. Thank you, everyone. Please stay safe. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to either Jack or myself. Our emails are listed there. Have a great day, everybody, and thank you so much.